Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of one of my favorite, if not my favorite thing to talk about all friggin' year. We're talking about the French Revolution, right? This is definitely one of my periods of expertise. I've read so many books about this particular thing, and every single time I always find it enthralling, right? Like, it never gets old. So going into it, though, you have to understand where we left off in class. We were talking about the reasons why the French Revolution is going to break out, and then we were also beginning to discuss the entire crumbling ancient regime, right? So now this is really, really important just because we are looking at a France right now that basically had a lot of ways that they could have solved a lot of the issues that they were having leading up to their revolution, but they just kind of chose not to and chose to take old ways out and refused to kind of acknowledge the way that the world was developing and the way that economics were really developing. And also, they really, really kind of failed to realize that poor people are starting to get really, really upset because they don't have any food. Now, going into it though, we have to understand where we left off. We left off talking about the estates in general. We talked about the first estate, right, being that of the clergy, being the smallest of the estates, but owning 10% of all of the land. Then we talked about the second estate, being the nobility, being one of the other smaller populations, only being about 1.5% of the entire population of France, right? But also then those two estates, first and second, go together to make the most wealthy, and they control about 90% of the nation's wealth, right? Leaving 10% of the nation's wealth for this estate, right? The other 24 million people running around out there, right? So this right here is the third estate, also known in French as everybody else, right? Not really, I just love saying everybody else because I think it's funny, and if you don't think it's funny, you're a fun ruiner. Grow up. Now, anyway, so going into it, that you have to understand, you have three different types of people in that. You got the bourgeois, the rural peasants, and the urban workers, right? Bourgeois just meaning upper class gentry figures, right? You're talking about people that are wealthy enough to be wealthy in this class, but not wealthy enough to buy their way into the nobility or achieve that robe noble status, right? You also have rural peasants who are your tenant farmers and workers and your peasants in general. And then you also have your urban workers who are your people that had begun migrating from rural areas during the 1700s into the cities to find work and labor, and they have it the worst of the worst. They are typically the most economically dissolute. They usually are struggling to find food. Cities are charging buttloads of money currently for bread. Problems are arising, right? And then we also have about the fact that those three groups of people combine together to pay about 99% of the taxes, with a heavy amount of the tax burden falling on the bourgeois class, right? Now, why do I have a picture of Starbucks right here? Because I think it's really, really important to know that you're dealing with somebody who loves history, not somebody who's going to teach it to you the exact way the College Board wants to see it, because I refuse, right? Because the College Board wants to teach you the basic Betty view of the French Revolution, right? The basic belief, the Starbucks belief of the French Revolution is that the growing tensions between the wealthy bourgeois and the old nobility was stifling the economy, and that basically the bourgeois thought the old nobility was stifling the economy, which would then lead to revolution, right? Well, the thing about it though is that is only one small element of this. The thing that you had to understand is that actually the real situation is that people from all classes are beginning to notice how the disparity of economics and how the disparity of their social class system in France was crushing France both financially and culturally, right? They were basically all beginning to realize that the old way of doing things is leading France down a bad path, right? And when they kept trying to get people to notice, people kept refusing to notice, and that's going to be what blows up into revolution, right? It's when you refuse to get on board with new reforms is going to be the moment when people start picking up sticks and guns and start shooting them at you, all right? So going into the next one, though, you have to understand is that this never would have been possible, though. These beliefs these criticisms, these issues with the monarchy and also with the old order of things would have never come along if the monarchy hadn't been kind of desacralized a little bit, right? And what desacralization means, or the desacralization of the monarchy, is that ever since the death of Louis XIV, the process of making the monarchy seem a lot less holy and secularizing it had begun, with the main illness that caused this process being the Enlightenment, right? As Enlightenment thinkers are coming out and they're beginning to refute royal authority, and they are beginning to actually advocate for more rights and natural-born rights, i.e. John Locke and Montesquieu and all these other figures. A lot of people in France are beginning to realize that they view now the monarch as less of a god divine right rulership of the absolutist monarchs of the 1600s, your Louis XIV, and they're now beginning to look upon them as just being kind of lame and being people that you can criticize. And we have to understand that there are a lot of causes to why this happened, though, right? It's not just announced the Enlightenment stuff, and we'll get back to that here in a moment, all right? But a lot of other things are just kind of blowing up in these monarchs' faces, and with a world where we have the printing press running better than it ever has, with people realizing that they are now getting a hold of news quicker than they ever have, and they actually have lenses into the inner workings of their politics more than they ever have, you have to understand that people in France, especially the bourgeois, are beginning to realize that mercantilism is a reckless form of economy, right? The idea of telling you who you can and can't trade with, who you can and can't sell to, who you can and can't do things with in a free market system that many of the other countries are beginning to adopt is ruining the economy of France. They also are realizing that the monarchs recklessly spend things, right? They are recklessly spending money on palaces, on royal meetings, on these other things like that. And you also have to understand, though, as well, that most of this is going on underneath the rulership of this man by the name of Louis XV, right? He is the grandson of Louis XIV. That's little Louis right there when he actually took over because he was a mere 5 years old. And that right there is Peter the Great, right? Peter the Great actually went and met him on their grand tour. But the thing about it, though, is that this is what he looked like as he got older, and apparently he was a notorious Lothario, all right, which means he liked to have parties and stuff like that more than he liked to do anything else. And he also made some bad bets on some wars, right? Because the constant wars that France was inside of ever since Louis XIV was in power, Louis XV continued that tradition, right? Including the War of Austrian Succession, including the 7 Years' War, including the French and Indian War, including also, what was the one that came? Oh yeah, and then the aftermath of the War of Spanish Succession, right? And all of these wars were losses for France, right? They lost the War of Spanish Succession. They lost the 7 years in the French and Indian. They only incurred more debt during the Austrian Succession War because it was nothing but a tie, right? So you have to understand that this is incurring even more financial crises onto them. And also, in the process of all this going on as well, is the parlements are beginning to return to a little bit of their power, right? Due to the spread of information with the printing press running rampant, parlements are beginning to actually advocate for the rights of representative bodies and representative classes of government, and so they're now beginning to exert some of their authority again over Louis XIV and XV. But then after Louis XV died, as the parlements are beginning to grow their power further and further, Louis XV croaks and then is replaced by a man by the name of Louis XVI, who is Louis XV's grandson, right? Louis XV, all right, also used to make fun of Louis XVI all the time because he used to say that he was extremely weak and that he was shy and that he didn't know how to do anything and that he was going to be a terrible leader. And this guy right here, Louis XVI, also known as Louis Auguste, did not even want to be leader of France. He did not desire to be king. We believe that he may have been somewhere on this, like possibly on like the learning disabled spectrum. We're not really sure. He really struggled emotionally, actually connecting with people, and he apparently multiple different times said that, why can't I resign when these other people get to resign their jobs, right? He doesn't even want to do this, and he's also married to a woman that the French people hate. All right, oh yeah, that right there is Marie Antoinette, his very, very young but beautiful Austrian wife, right? She was merely a peace treaty that was brought over leading up to the 7 Years' War, and she would be married off to Louis at the tender age of 15, and Louis XVI was a mere 16 years old when they got married, right? Now, the thing about it, though, is that Louis XVI is not only a weak ruler, but also the French people hate his wife, right? And so they're just doing all this negative press about him all the time, and they're making fun of him in all these new illegal periodicals that are running around all over France, and the man just can't stop all the criticism that's coming at him because, like I said, information is now more accessible than it ever has been. For example, there was reports apparently actually off the coast of Portugal that people had seen a harpy or a siren or a mythical beast that actually has a woman's head and a monster's body that used to actually kind of lure in sailors and stuff like that. Now, a harpy and a siren I know are two completely different things, but literally we don't know exactly which one they said it was. So now look, but anyway, so they actually did pictures of it. It had like a weird face and stuff like that and like a lizardy body. Well, the pamphlets that were running around in France were actually of the harpy drawn with Marie Antoinette's face, right? They made fun of her. They accused her of being reckless with her money. They made fun of her whenever she entered into this phase of her life known as her shepherd phase, right? It was just a phase. And when she tried to actually be like kind of poor, she was like, I want to know what it's like to be a farmer. And she had like a little like ranch with sheep on it and stuff like that. And she would harvest eggs in the morning. She's like, oh, I understand the plight of the poor now. What she didn't realize is that butlers were running out there in the morning every single day to spray the sheep with perfume and to wipe the eggs off before she got out there. So basically you have two kind of space cadet rulers, right? Marie Antoinette, a little bit like less blame on her, because honestly, she didn't really do anything wrong, and she was literally also brought over there just to be like a baby factory, which is ridiculous. But Louis XVI, on the other hand, was not a strong leader, right? He couldn't shake this like MO of trying to get people to love him. Like, he really wanted people to like him more than he wanted to be revered. So you could argue one of the biggest things is he was not Machiavellian, like, whatsoever. Where Louis XIV probably was worse for France than Louis XVI, at least he had authority, and the people of France would listen to him when he said stuff. And then on top of everything else, the other worst financial decision that Louis XV, Louis XVI's grandfather, could have ever made was when he supported the American Revolution, right? He began the process of supporting the Americans, and then Louis XVI finished the entire thing off, right? But the American Revolution was directly supported by the French, i.e., according to Riley Pinapinto, who said that in class yesterday, which I was super impressed by. Good job, Riley. All right, so yeah, but they directly financially supported the Americans against the English, right? Combine that with the Enlightenment, and you got a bunch of French people that have now been inspired to have a revolution of their own, right? This is going to have huge impacts, both practical and ideological, on the French, okay? Because the support of the Americans, one, is going to bankrupt the crown of France completely, like far worse than they ever had been. Now, this was a bet that the French had made, thinking to themselves, well, America produces a lot of timber and a lot of goods, right? And they have a burgeoning burgeoning manufacturing system over there. So maybe when they establish themselves as an economy, we'll be able to reap the benefits of like all the tobacco they grow and all that stuff, right? The issue is that the American Revolution didn't end until 1783, and like the French Revolution is going to start by 1789. So you don't even America didn't even have enough time to get its political system figured out enough, let alone to pay the French back, right? So the thing about it, though, is that this is going to bankrupt the crown completely, and the people of France thought the Americans were so BA. They thought they were so awesome, being like, wait a minute, if they can have a revolution, we can have one too, right? And not only was that limited to regular people in France, but it extended even into some of their most famous figures, including the Marquis de Lafayette, who directly supported the American Revolution and fought in it alongside of George Washington, right? Marquis de Lafayette looked up to George Washington so much, and he was like, you are a hero for your people, and you have literally become the father of a country that is basing its essence in natural rights, liberty, and freedom, right? And, well, except for all the enslavement that was going on, which was ridiculous, and I love how we're like so short-sighted on that. But still, the thing about it, though, is that the Marquis de Lafayette was directly inspired, and he fought in battles during the American Revolution against the English, right? And you can see him right here looking all dashing and stuff like that. And we'll come back to that picture again a little bit later on, but when he returned back to France, he thought that this could be achieved in France, possibly without a war, but he did believe that a revolution of ideology was in need, right? Now, he never wanted it to break out into violence, which it did later on, but he did think that France could be changed for the better, right? And then also on the flip side, French people started idolizing a lot of the American figures a lot. One in particular being that of Benjamin Franklin, right? They literally put Benjamin Franklin's face on everything in France, right? Because he, one, was the ambassador to France, but then also, two, he's Benjamin Franklin. He's the lightning man himself, and he is also a part of the American Revolution. We love him. He's so smart. And so what ends up happening is they put Benjamin Franklin's face on everything. They put it on towels and dishes and postcards and all this other stuff, and people would have pictures of Benjamin Franklin hanging up in their house in France, right? Now, this pissed off Louis XVI so much, though, literally pissed him off so much, that he actually ends up having Benjamin Franklin's face painted in the bottom of one of his chamber pots so he could go to the bathroom on it all the time, because he was so annoyed that everybody was idolizing the Americans so much, right? Now, the American Revolution also represented directly Enlightenment ideals in action. You've got the social contract violation that actually is going to occur when Britain is unjustly taxing the Americans so aggressively, leading to a dysfunction in their contract, and basically the people of America being like, we don't owe you squat, and then going at them and attacking them and trying to overthrow them and create a new government, right? You also have John Locke's natural rights being embedded into the Constitution and Bill of Rights. You have Rousseau's general will concept being used for a representative elected government, right? You also have as well Montesquieu's multi-branch checks and balances system being integrated into the American government later. Not immediately. At first, they did this thing called the Articles of Confederation. It was a little too separated. It was very, very weak. But anyway, later on, when James Madison comes along, he actually creates an American government system that's based off the concept of the separation of powers by Montesquieu, right? Now, another big thing that's going to happen, though, as well, and this is probably arguably the most important thing out of all the biggest causes, is the financial crisis and the access to food. It can easily be argued that these are the largest causes of the French Revolution. Because, yes, were we inspired by the Americans? I say we as if I'm French. I wish. So I say, like, yes, were they inspired by the Americans? Yes, was the ancient regime stifling their ability to fix problems? Yes. Was the desacralization of the monarchy leading to a bunch of issues where they were looking at their king and being like, bleh? Like, yeah, yes, it was, right? All that stuff is valid, right? But these two things are the most real short-term causes to the entire thing, right? What I mean by short term is they popped up within about a handful of decades, right? And they literally are going to be the thing that stokes the fire of resentment, the bellows, if you will, that gets the flame of the revolution truly burning. Because without money and without food, you can't do squat, right? And we're going to focus on the financial crisis first, all right? So when we're looking at this, you have to understand, first and foremost, France got no money. France has no money, all right? So like, now, they have some money, you know what I mean? But like they don't have a tax system that's actually working, all right? Because 50% of all the money that they're actually raising in France via taxes right now is being used to pay off the interest on their debts. And I don't know if you know how interest works, but basically that's money that lenders are charging you just to borrow money, right? So you might as well be setting half of the French tax funds on fire, right? So like now, you might as well just be ripping it apart because it's not going towards your debt whatsoever. And the other 50% of it was being used to fund the monarchy and to rebuild parts of Versailles and to fund the military and all this other stuff, right? Only 16% of it was left to actually address the financial crisis and or gain more food for people in France. 16% of your taxes, that's garbage. All right, so now look, so going into the next part of the financial crisis, you also have to understand that the first and second estate were still barely being taxed in this entire process, and every single time there was a movement to try and get them to pay more taxes, they shut it down. One of the best examples of this being this thing called the Assembly of Notables in 1787, where Louis XVI met with several of the lead figures from the first and second estate, right? And he was like, please, if you just pay more in taxes, all this will get better. If you just pay more in taxes and we actually incorporate maybe more free market ideas, we can actually get going. And he had several different finance ministers that were trying to help propagate this idea, including Brienne, Turgot, like Cologne, even though Cologne was like kind of a weirdo and might have been having an affair with like Marie Antoinette, we don't know. But the thing about it that you have to understand is they were advocating for this whole idea, and Louis XVI was trying to solve the problem. And at the Assembly of Notables, he called in some of the most heavy hitters of those estates, and they said no to him. They just were like, yeah, no, we're not doing that, right? And they were like, well, we're not going back to our parlements, and we're not advocating for more tax collection because you don't know how to fund an economy, right? And so literally this like image went out all over France that was a wolf trying to talk to a bunch of birds, right? And basically what's going on in this thing is like, it's supposed to be like the monarchy is the wolf and the first and second estate members are the birds, and the wolf is asking the birds, how would you like to be cooked, right? And so this is another example of that negative press going out there, but the Assembly of Notables was a dramatic failure, and they couldn't get them to agree to pay more in taxes. And then also, though, let's put the real big cause out there. Probably the biggest cause, if you were to even further break this down, is food access, right? Because the bulk of the people in France are rural peasants, right? Or urban workers. But the most of them are in what you would consider the lower socioeconomic status areas, right? And bad weather is causing a lot of issues, so they're having terrible grain harvests, and also the price of bread is skyrocketing. It's about, like, at this time, right before the revolution, about 4 times more than it should be, right? I mean, so, like, the price of food can oftentimes indicate a lot of political shifts, right? So, like, the thing that you have to understand, though, that is that's a really big indicator of things that can shift back and forth is how much consumers have to pay for things, right? And so the price of bread was, like, at some of the highest it had ever been, close to about a week's wage of a regular person. And also the ingredients that were being used in the bread, because the harvests were so bad, were literally starting to get really low quality, right? Because this right here is what most French people ate. It's called black bread, and you would buy a whole, like, 4-pound loaf of it and eat off of it for a week, you and your family would. But to try and stretch the wheat out as much as they could, you had a bunch of bakers like mixing in sawdust into it from wood, trying to make it stretch as far as it possibly could to make as much money off of it, right? You also have exorbitant taxes going on to essential goods, like salt was more expensive than it ever had been, which is a necessary ingredient for making bread, but it also is necessary for curing meat and preserving their food, right? So basically you have all this happening, and so riots are starting to break out in cities and in Paris. There was this very famous riot known as the Night of the Broken Tiles, right? Or like basically the Day of the Tiles, when like one of the villages in the outskirts of like on outside of Paris started just rioting and freaking out due to the price of bread and due to the amount of taxes that were going out there, right? So you've got riots, you have early violence, you've got notables and nobles and clergy members that are refusing to pay more taxes. So what's going to happen is Louis is going to be forced to call something. And the thing he's going to be forced to call is this thing known as the Estates General, right? Now, what this thing is very, very important. When he calls the Estates General, it's pretty much his last effort, right? It is his last chance to try and fix all of these issues. The Estates General, what it is a representative body, okay? So basically an election would be held, right? Where they picked representatives to represent each estate. And the Estates General is only called during times of crisis. And the last time it was called was in 1614 underneath the rulership of Louis XIII, and Cardinal Richelieu ran this estates, right? Do you see what I'm talking about here, right? It's been a long time since this bad boy has been called, in over 100 years, right? And you only call it when you absolutely have to, when public opinion is completely necessary, right? And he was told, Louis XVI was told to do this, because remember, Louis XVI is a pretty weak king, right? Was told to do this by the new finance minister that he had hired, much to the cheering of many Frenchmen, right? A lot of French people loved this guy, right? And his name was Jacques Necker, right? And Jacques is a very, very important figure. Jacques Necker, you can call him, right? Is a very important figure who is from Switzerland, and he's a shrewd finance minister, right? He believes in cutting costs where he can, and he believes in trying to increase tax revenue from the first and second estate, right? A lot of the people on the third estate were like, yeah, Jacques, wow! And they were super excited that he got hired, right? And so the thing you have to understand is Jacques was the one that told him, you got to call the estates, man, and you got to get him in here now, and we got to figure out how to address all these problems, right? And the way that they wanted to address the problems is they sent out these things called cahiers to all the different villages and cities and places and towns all over France, right? And a cahier, what it is a notebook, right? And they were told to write down the issues that their places were facing. And then representatives of the crown would go through all the notebooks, and they would categorize all of the complaints, and they would address all of them at the Estates General to make sure a revolution could be avoided, right? And the way it was supposed to work was on the day of the Estates General starting, they were supposed to have 3 different representative bodies to represent the 3 different estates. You had the clergy that sat on this side, the king and Jacques Necker who operated up here. You've got the nobles that sat on this side, and then you have the third estate who sat in the back, right? Now, this was also a little bit of an insult as well, because there was a big ceremony that was held to actually start the Estates General and all this other stuff. But what ended up happening is it was a giant embarrassment for a lot of the third estate members, because they were forced to wear black robes and stuff like that, and they had to come in dead silence while the other 2 came in to music. And so things got started off on a really, really bad foot day 1, right? But here's the even bigger reason why the third estate was so angry at the Estates General, and a lot of it had to do with how they voted. Each estate got 1 vote, right? So all of the nobles collectively got together and decided how they would vote with 1 vote, right? And then all the nobles got together and got 1 vote. Not per person, per group, right? And so you only have 3 votes being counted in this entire thing, right? Now, this is an issue because, yes, do these groups of people agree on some things, right? Like food access, yes, they agree on that, right? Do they agree that the monarchy needs to be limited a little bit? They also, a lot of them even agreed in the Constitution. They were like, we should probably get like some kind of document like outlining our rights, right? Yes, they agreed on some stuff, but every time tax increases would come up, right? The first and second estate would lobby together, and they would outvote the third estate, right? And the third estate is like, this is bullcrap because we represent 99% of France, but there's just as many of us in this room as there are of y'all, right? So like, he's like, look, there's like 300 of us, there's 300 like clergy members, and there's 300 nobility members, right? This is garbage. And so what a bunch of these figures and what a bunch of these third estate members were saying is they were like, hey, we need to double our size, right? We should be twice as big, and instead of voting by class, We should vote by head, right? As in, like, how many votes total in the room, right? And every single representative should have their own vote, right? And Louis got together with Jacques and they agreed only on one thing, to just double their size, which did nothing. So they rejected this entire concept, which led to the formation of this thing known as the National Assembly and also an event known as the Tennis Court Oath, which we will talk about that stuff in class. It's one of my favorite things to discuss. Can't wait to continue this story with y'all. I will see y'all tomorrow right after our quiz. We'll get into this whole thing. See y'all soon though, okay? Y'all have a good one.